Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for introducing your organization so succinctly, and thank you, Dana, for even keeping the presentations on time and on track. We all witnessed one of the hazards of new communication technologies with the first video, and so did I individually when my internet access was interrupted during the round of presentations. But so as far as I could follow it, two keywords came up again and again, and they were resilience and adaptability. Let me add a third one, shaping the future. And that is what our discussion today is about, and which I had the privilege now to introduce in a way. I try to summarize and update the think piece that you've all seen, and some of you perhaps even read, and I will focus on what, in my view, agencies and consequently ACA could or should do. So as everybody watching TV knows, we are still in the midst of the pandemic, and the situation in some countries like India is catastrophic and will impact and does impact international mobility and relations very, very heavily right now. It is not foreseeable that the pandemic will stop over the next couple of weeks or even months, not in North America and Western Europe, and much less so worldwide. Still, there is some moderate optimism, as I saw in the last meeting of the TPG, but still moderate. Our Norwegian colleagues reported that 15% of the people surveyed expected to return to normalcy in the winter term 21-22, 15%. That's not too much, and the remainder later or even much later. Still, some, and certainly some new normalcy is in sight, and we need to reflect what we can do, not just to expect the future, but to shape it. First year of the pandemic has certainly been the biggest crisis all of us have experienced in our lifetimes, all of us and everywhere. Just to remind you of a few of the figures we see, first enrollments are down in those countries where we have statistics between 20 and 65%. Tuition income has been halved in Australia. Credit mobility is down between 20 and 100% in Europe. And we see that students don't like the substitute of so-called virtual mobility. Staff mobility is close to zero, but much academic interaction has certainly moved online. Let me still say that there are achievements that we, all of us, I think, can be proud of. And that is the resilience and rapid adaptation in higher education institutions and in our agencies. Frankly, something I wouldn't have expected, perhaps in our agencies, but certainly not in the more traditional and conservative higher education institutions. Still, we got it, and we got it quickly. Several vaccines are available only 1 year into the pandemic. If you think there's still no vaccine against AIDS, there are several vaccines available and in use, and that's also due to international research cooperation. And all of us had made a leap forward, so with some hazards, as we've seen, in the use of technology, online learning, research communication, and program administration. I wish to focus now on the challenges that are ahead and on the answers that we might give. So the first question is, do we know what will be the effects on student mobility once restrictions and travel restrictions are lifted? Some people, like, as you just saw, Alan Goodman, think there will be a surge. So people will want to move even more than before. But there are others who predict that there will be ongoing restrictions, that people will simply change their horizons, so limit them, and will not want or not be able to move as much as they did before. So we don't know that. What we can foresee is that public and private finances will become tighter in the immediate future. We do see the temptation of calling for internationalization without mobility, which has the big advantage for governments to be much cheaper, but which might not have the same advantages for students and scholars. And finally, we are seeing a political backlash against globalization that might also affect internationalization. I think our agencies have two missions. That one is to stimulate and be leaders in the internationalization discourse in our countries. And second, to adapt and develop programs in order to best serve institutions, students, and scholars. I will talk about 4 points as to that, and that is the narrative, the approach, a comprehensive approach, the use of technology, and the necessity to strike a balance between conflicting interests and expectations. Let us start with a case for international mobility, because I think this case needs to be made, because the temptation to say, well, this is a luxury problem. We have much more urgent issues to deal with. And now, in the end, we've seen that the world has not broken down for students when they were not traveling to Barcelona. So we are confronted, I think, with this challenge to develop a convincing narrative for international mobility. And of course, we've all done that in the past, and so I won't elaborate very much on that. I think we all know that interaction, intercultural and international interaction benefits learning and research, so makes it more productive, innovative, and original. That one of the great advantages of physical mobility is to experience the unexpected, and sometimes even the unwelcome. But it's sometimes these unexpected experiences we've made when we first traveled abroad that have shaped our image of the world for a lifetime. I think international student mobility is also a unique opportunity for the less privileged, because it's probably their first opportunity, and maybe in some instances even their last, to personally experience another country. So having said this, it's certainly necessary to make internationalization and international mobility more inclusive than it currently is. So we need a good story, but we also need facts to base that story on. So we need more evidence, and we need to produce that evidence in our agencies and on a European level with ACA, and we need to distribute it. So all of what I just said is hopefully true, but it's better if it's also proven, and if we have evidence to support our story. What we will see is that even more so than before, that internationalization is not just mobility. All of us tend to overestimate the role of mobility because that's our main business. But I think, and there's a good reason for that. But if we see internationalization at home not as a stopgap or a substitute of mobility, it is a necessary complement for all the people who will never be mobile or who aren't mobile right now. It's about content and interaction. And we need to think, I think, what funding agencies like you guys can actually do to promote it. I think it's anything but evident that we should not just support cross-border cooperation and cross-border mobility, but also domestic change in curricula, modes of delivery, and so forth. But I think there's a good case for that. And I think that that space should be occupied by organizations like ours. both in terms of programs of funding and certainly in providing expert advice and the exchange of good practice. Zooming in, make intelligent use of technology. I've written quite a bit about that in my think piece, and I will just briefly summarize 2 points now. I think it's important to keep in mind that international online teaching is not just broadcasting what you're doing in Bochum or Strasbourg or whatever for a worldwide audience. It's not just broadcasting what you do anyhow, perhaps with English and Chinese subtitles, but it needs to take care, both content-wise and interaction-wise, of a more diverse clientele than you would have in your domestic classroom. And then, of course, virtual education needs a specific pedagogy that is sensitive to intercultural difference and encourages intercultural interaction in the virtual classroom. There again, the question is, what can we as agencies do about it? And in fact, some agencies are already doing that in supporting the development and adaptation of virtual and blended programs for an international target group. And I think probably the main field where there is room for action for funding agencies, internationalization funding agencies, is to adapt existing material to a more diverse and broader audience. There is the delicate question of why every university and every department needs to develop its own virtual material. I know, of course, so I've worked in the field for 40 years, that every single professor is convinced that he or she is the best one to teach Calculus 101 or Introduction to Macroeconomics, but that might not be the case, and at any rate, it will be much cheaper and cost-effective if resources are pooled and material is developed that can be used by a number of universities. There is the important question if we should give and award scholarships for people who stay put and do not move but take part in virtual learning. I know that several member organizations are right now offering scholarship for online learning for people who are not physically mobile, but it's rather seen as a transitional matter, and we need to think about it if we want to do that even beyond that. And then perhaps to mention that at the end, one of the most thorough effects, I think, of the pandemic even now is the radical move of marketing activities to the internet and to online. And it's difficult to foresee that all of us will be traveling again to higher education fairs with 30,000 people if the advice and information can be made available also in other ways. My last point is the conflicting interests and expectations that we need to deal with. So we are seeing a trend to more blended learning, which might lead to more travel for shorter periods with a larger footprint, which is not really what sustainability is all about. So we need to think about a reasonable relation between travel and length of stay. We need to think again if shorter programs are really more inclusive, which we have been led to think over the last couple of years, but of course who face these sustainability issues. Personal contact is great and expensive, so we need to make a strong case both to governments and to students' parents to pay for it. And I think we have a good case, but we need to make it. And finally, we tend to discuss most about mobility between our wealthy developed countries. And we're talking too little mostly about the global South. And the big question is, will the pandemic make quality higher education and research even less accessible for students and scholars in the global South? Or can we also use that opportunity, this challenge, to make the world a bit more equitable also in our field? So thank you so much for my attention.